Most briefs cripple the music before a single note is written, and it usually starts the same way, with genre. We need something orchestral and epic, or we're thinking lo-fi but with more energy. It sounds specific, but it isn't. All it tells you is what the music should resemble, not what it's supposed to do. And resemblance is a poor substitute for purpose. If you start with genre, the best you can hope for is something that fits. It might sound correct, though it will rarely feel necessary. The question that matters is far simpler and almost always unasked. What is the music doing in the moment? What is it supporting, amplifying, undermining, or clarifying? Is it carrying tension, releasing it, disguising it, or making it unavoidable? Music's not just there to decorate the scene, it's there to shape how the player experiences it. If that function remains undefined, then all that's left is guesswork, and guesswork is how you end up with something that sounds right and yet is void of substance. The next thing that tends to appear is a tirade of adjectives. Dark but not depressing, cinematic but grounded, futuristic but organic. It reads like direction, but it isn't. It's ambiguity dressed up as specificity. Adjectives are subjective, and worse yet, they shift dependent on context. What you hear as dark might register to someone else as slow or sparse or simply underwritten. Epic might mean choir to one person or distorted synthesis to another. So instead of narrowing the target, you blur it. The composer now has to interpret your interpretation before they can even begin. What actually helps is context, not what it should feel like in isolation, but why it should feel that way. What just happened? What is the player processing? What state are they in when the music arrives? Once those become clear, language becomes unnecessary because the work has something to attach itself to. References are another common crutch. A collection of links, usually well-intentioned, though rarely examined. Something like this. And again, it sounds helpful until we examine it closely. What part of this? Is it the instrumentation, the pacing, the structure, the mix, the emotional arc? Most of the time that's not even been decided. So the reference is standing in for a decision yet unmade. And so the composer is left to reverse engineer your taste from fragments, all the while you're sat back waiting for something original. That tension is where things start to drift. Because references are useful, but only if we reach a common understanding as to what we're referencing and why. If you want to carry that over, you need to be explicit on what you want to avoid, what you want to incorporate, and what might be missing. Without those aspects being defined, we're outsourcing thinking. Then there's the matter of constraint, which is usually either absent or arbitrary. Creativity does benefit from limits, but only when those limits are tied to something real. A technical requirement, a gameplay condition, a pacing constraint that exists in the experience. Stating that you need 2-minute loops that fade cleanly is not a meaningful constraint, that's a format. If, however, you say encounters last between 45 and 90 seconds but can chain indefinitely, so the music needs to sustain tension without being fatiguing or being obvious in its repetition, that's something you can design around. One describes a shape, the other describes a problem to be solved, and it is the problem resolution that produces better work. Constraints aren't there to restrict the composer, but they are there to give their decisions weight. But that can only happen if you explain why they exist. Context is the part most often withheld, usually in the name of efficiency. The composer is given a description, perhaps a reference, and expected to produce something that will later be dropped into a system they've not seen. Which is why so much music feels detached from the experience it's supposed to serve, because it was written in isolation. If you want something that actually integrates, the composer needs to understand where it lives, what precedes it, what follows it, what the player is doing whilst it plays? What else is competing for attention? Be that dialogue, interface, perhaps even silence. Without that, the work can only approximate its role, though with it, it can be shaped to and around the crucial moments. The difference is far from subtle. Then there's the tendency to separate the technical from the emotional, as if one can exist cleanly without the other. Format, stems, loop length, sample rates, all necessary, all irrelevant for the purpose of creativity, because none of that explains why the music exists. Every cue, no matter how abstract the game, is carrying some form of intent. It's responding to something. It's guiding the player towards something. And if that remains undefined, the composer is left to impose it themselves, which may or may not align with what you had in mind. The simplest question, and the one most often avoided, is also the most useful. What should the player feel here, and why? If we can't answer that, the rest of the brief is irrelevant. At a broader level, there's often no clear sense of what role music is supposed to play in the project at all. Whether it's foreground or background, whether it reacts or simply accompanies, whether silence is part of the language or something to be avoided, these decisions are either left until late or never explicitly made. And so the work lacks cohesion. One moment it's assertive, the next it disappears, which can be by design, but more often it's by accident. The teams that avoid this are not necessarily more experienced, they're simply more deliberate. They decide early and in certain terms how music should behave in the game. Not in exhaustive detail, but in principle. Once that's understood, everything else that follows has something to align with. All of this comes back to a single point. A brief is not a specification document, it's a starting position. But if you treat it as a fixed set of instructions, you'll get exactly what you asked for, though very little beyond it. If you treat it as a way of sharing intent, of exposing what matters and what doesn't, then it becomes something else entirely. It becomes the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of one. So the question is not how to write a better brief in the abstract, it's whether you are leaving any room for the work to exceed it. Because if every decision has already been made before the composer begins, then the outcome's already capped. You're not commissioning something new. You're requesting a reconstruction of something that already exists. If you want better results, the adjustment is not complicated. So stop describing what it should sound like and start describing what it needs to do. Stop hiding behind adjectives and start explaining the moment. Use references to clarify, though not to constrain. Introduce constraints that actually matter. Share enough context for the work to attach itself to something real. Decide, at least in principle, what role music plays in the project. And then, once all of that is in place, step back just enough to allow the person you hired to actually do something with it. Because the quality of the result is not determined by how tightly you define the brief. It's determined by how clearly you can communicate the intent and how much space you leave for it to become something you did not fully anticipate. You don't need a more detailed brief. You need a better starting point.